Muito boa tarde a todos e a todas. I will turn now to English. Good afternoon to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want particularly to thank the organizing committee for the invitation to share Professor Biesta's presentation here. I have this initial task of presenting the person who is going to do the keynote, and to be completely honest, first, it is not the first time I do this. So we've done this before, no, not across Europe, but at least in Porto we've done this before. But it is also truly a pleasure and, in a way, a very challenging task. From one part, of course, it's a very easy task. It's a very easy task because we all have read a chapter or a paper or a book by Gert Biesta. And I'm sure that everybody in the audience has done this. By the way, in case you haven't, this is not a time to come out, because really it means that what you should do immediately after the talk is to go home and read a chapter or a book or a paper by Gert. You'll understand me better once you've heard him talk. So on one part, this is a very easy task. Gert he's currently a professor at the University of Edinburgh and the University of Maynooth. He has been a professor in several European universities across the UK, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and more recently in Ireland. He has been a visiting professor in several other European universities. He is a doctor honoris causa in several other universities, and he has published extensively in education, educational research, citizenship, and civic learning, what counts as good education, higher education, and educational research. So more recently, he has been dealing with probably what has been part of your first love as issues of teacher training, teacher agency, and this very compelling title that we have today on his keynote. A final thing I wanted to say about Professor Biesta's work is the fact that there are many people who obviously work in education and in other fields, but there are also some of these people who work in the field of education who are true scholars. A true scholar generally is capable of balancing the past and the future in education. And I'm quoting here, of course, Arendt, who Biesta is also very much familiar and very much, I think, appreciates. And what is true is someone who makes this balance between the past and the future is someone who is capable of being an expert in reading the classics in education and bringing the classics in education to a debate and a confrontation of the current contemporary challenges to education. Thank you for the small music. When talking about the classics, it's always nice to have a little bit of contemporary music to remind us that the classics go well every time. But what I was trying to say here is that what is most interesting, in my view, and I hope that you'll also appreciate, is the fact that this deep reading and the deep thinking that comes with it, and that enables Gert Biesta to produce a very novel, a very innovative, a very challenging, and thinking about contemporary issues in education. So with no further delay, Gert, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction. I've already figured out that in order for that to look good, I need to talk slower than that I'm talking, and that's an impossibility, so you could probably better watch here than there, but let's see. I'm really grateful for the invitation, because the question of teacher education is a really important one, and I think many countries are engaging with it, maybe also struggling with it, and the more wisdom and insight we can bring together, I think the better it will be for teacher education itself. But the point of teacher education is, of course, to have fantastic teachers and therefore fantastic education. But they are an important part in that. I begin by having to say I grew up in a very Calvinist country, the Netherlands, and Calvinists like precision. And that still sort of is a burden for me. Because I think a field like education is so big that we need a plurality of voices and views and visions. So I always try to be a pluralist, but it is hard work. But I think that is really important for our field. Some of you may remember that Margaret Thatcher used this slogan, "There is no alternative." And I think that's the most dangerous point to reach. I would say there must always be an alternative, and if at one point in time we can't see the alternative, then we need to do hard intellectual and political work, at least to put an alternative on the table, so that we have something to choose, and that we understand that if we go for A, we're not going for B. And for me, that is one reason why we need plurality in the field of education, need to take our intellectual work seriously, and then see where we move from that. The final thing, what I really like about the framing of these 2 days is that it's about building an agenda. Let me have a look. For the 21st century for teacher education. So I brought my Sharpie and I thought, well, all the presenters will add something to this agenda. It's still quite wide there. So one thing I would like to do is to put the whole question of the art of teaching and the artistry of teachers on this agenda, not as the single orientation, but as an alternative to consider. So I'll try to speak about that for maybe 35 minutes so that we also have time for some interaction. There is quite a lot of text on the PowerPoint which you may find helpful. Some evidence says that you can only have, 10 words on a PowerPoint slide, but who cares? So my ambition in this talk is to push back a little against what I would call a particular common sense about teachers and teaching. A particular image that is emerging that says this is teaching and this is the work of the teacher. And as I have explained, that's not to say all that there is bad, but it's to open up the space and say, are there different ways to think about that? This is important for teacher education because I think that if we do not ground all our work in teacher education and all the policy around that in a view of what teaching is and what teachers do, then I think we don't have a good sense of direction. That was behind my question this morning. What are sort of the conceptions of the good teacher that we have in our mind implicitly, explicitly? And the suggestion I want to do is to say maybe it makes sense to think of teaching as an art, but actually not a single art, but a double art. There is something really multidimensional, I think, in education. I'll talk about that. And that requires that one thing we do in teacher education is to help student teachers to develop, deepen, broaden their educational artistry. So that's the point I'm going to work towards. Now, views about the good teacher also conjure images about teaching. And what I want to have a look at together with you are two possible images of teaching. And it's to play a bit, but also to make a serious point. The first I want to show is this one. This is a really big painting, in my memory it's 3 by 3 meters, that hangs in the Scottish National Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh, a museum devoted to portraits. So most of the rooms are terribly boring because you just have these paintings of people's heads, but this one stands out. It was painted by Ken Curry, a Scottish artist, and it's called Going into the Dark. And what's happening on that painting? Curry was asked to portrait 3 professors of oncology from the University of Edinburgh. And of course he could have done the boring thing, but he started to talk to them because he wanted to get a sense of what they do, what it means to be sort of at the top of your field in oncology. And one thing that struck him is that these 3 professors said, yes, we have all the knowledge, yes, we have all the research, yes, we have all the evidence, we have fantastic technology, but each time that we encounter a patient, we literally have to step and go into the dark because we can never be sure what we will find there. And that for them was actually at the heart of their professionality. Not to have all this stuff in the background, which is really important, but to understand that the job needs to be done in the encounter with always new, unique patients. And this rather chilling painting was precisely, you can say, trying to capture this moment of going into the dark. And I find this a very interesting picture to think about teaching, because we want our teachers to be knowledgeable, to be well equipped, to be proficient, to be skillful. But then again, we never know what we will meet in the classroom. So also in the professionality of teachers, there is this step in the dark, which requires a kind of courage and other qualities, which immediately raises the question, how do you work on that in teacher education? So this is one image, which I like, and it also looks odd. I want to show another image as well, and in a sense it connects to some other discussions. This is an image that appeared in a Scottish educational newspaper in 2017, when the Scottish government had just launched what was called the EEF Toolkit, something developed in England, a sort of summary of evidence about what works. And a journalist asked me about my view, also knowing that over the years I've expressed quite a lot of concerns about simplistic notions of what works. And journalists are, of course, always very good listeners, so they always look for the sentence where they think, yeah, that can be the title of the piece, and also sort of for the image they can use. Because at some point I said, one of my problems in this toolkit is that it brings with it a logic of what I said is close to pig farming, where you put something into a pig and you measure whether they grow, and that's it. And I said, I don't find that a very appealing image of what I think the work of the teacher is. So it was funny, and in a sense it also made the point. This is what was published based on work done in England and heavily sponsored by the English government. A list of all kind of interventions with the best sort of scientific evidence about what the impact of those interventions is, what it costs, which ones are cheap and which are very expensive, and what the evidence base of it is. Now, some people say this is a toolkit, and it's good that we provide our teachers with such toolkits because it can help them to make better judgments. There are also policymakers who say this is very helpful because it gives us an indication of where we should invest our money, where we can get sort of the best return on investment. I understand all that, but the thing that worries me as an educator and teacher educator is what is happening in the background in terms of how we understand education and the work of the teacher. And particularly the idea that teaching is a matter of interventions that should produce outcomes. There something worrying happens, and I want to look at that in a bit more detail. For me, it has something to do with developments that have been going on in education, probably globally, for the last 20 or 30 years, where I still see many people saying the base for teaching should be a knowledge base. You've heard that phrase probably. But also that the knowledge that should go into teaching should be empirical. And what empirical there often means is this idea that we need research that assesses the impact of particular interventions on student learning, that's the phrase being used, on the assumption that with better research we can find out what the most effective interventions are. There is a long tradition of school effectiveness research, and around that, coming both from research but also from policy, a call to make teaching into an evidence-based or an evidence-informed profession. I don't think that the real problem is whether teaching should be based or informed by evidence. For me, the question is, what conception of education and the work of the teacher comes with a particular notion of evidence? So I see it coming from research, from policy. What also worries me, and it was briefly mentioned earlier today, is that I also see teachers who say what we should be doing as teachers is to become effectiveness researchers of our own practice, which even goes so far that some teachers say, I split my classroom in an intervention group and a control group, and then I measure the outcomes, and then I know what is effective. And I think that is a mistake and a misunderstanding of that kind of research at a number of levels. Now, all this has something to do with how in many documents teachers are being positioned. And the documents that have been appearing over the past, again, I think 10, 15 years, really highlight the importance of teachers. Teachers matter. You can find that in documents from these kind of organizations. I would only say in brackets, for me there is always a question what the status of these organizations is and to what degree they are subject to democratic control or are free players. One of my worries about the OECD is that I cannot see any sort of democratic framing around it, but they are very vocal. So teachers matter, you can say, great. But again, the precise question to ask is, how do teachers matter in these reports? And then I often end up with claims like these, that research shows that the teacher is the most important in-school factor in the production of particular test scores. And then you can get excited and say, at last we have research that shows the importance of teachers. But when you begin to get a sense of where I'm coming from, I wonder, do I as a teacher want to be called a factor in the production of test scores, or is that really undermining my sense of professionality? So I have worries, and in the second half of my talk I want to put some things on the table to maybe rebalance this situation, to add some questions which I think need to be asked to make this into a meaningful development. Now, one thing that I find really interesting, also when I interact with colleagues who are far more optimistic about particular forms of research and evidence than I am, we we often find ourselves together around the starting point, which I would call the social justice argument for education, that every child and young person, irrespective of who they are, where they are from, should have access to good education. I think anyone who wants to question that should not be working in education and probably should also not be a member of government, but there you go. So the starting point, I think, is widely shared. But when you begin to look at the steps you can take when you start there, I see little steps that I think have ended up somewhere where I think we should not have ended up. So this is a really important and tremendously difficult question. How can we make sure that education is everywhere of the same quality? That is ultimately a matter of judgment, because quality is a qualitative matter and not a quantitative one. And judgment is, of course, always difficult because it's not black and white. Some people then said, yeah, that's the problem with judgment. Can't we get a bit more precision into this? And one little step is where people said, well, how can we actually measure the quality of education? There, I think, something begins to shift. Still, you can make a good attempt at saying, how can we inform our judgments? One other thing I've seen is that rather than trying to judge the quality of the whole educational provision, the focus has moved to what is often called educational outcomes. And I think that is a narrowing. Even if you go for that, then you can say, yeah, if outcomes matter, which outcomes should be measured? But then, because we always have too little time and too little money, some people say, well, which outcomes can be measured? Let's start with the easier ones, and then we'll complicate the picture later on. But that later on often doesn't arrive. And then I think when all these little steps happen, you begin with good intentions, but you end up somewhere where I think the measurement begins to drive the judgment, rather than that the judgment is informed by the measurement. And I've written a book about it to ask, where are these fundamental normative questions about education in this age of measurement? But measurement is an industry in itself. It grows very easily. It always comes with this promise that it gives clear answers, that it gives direction to politicians. And politicians often, when you sort of speak one-to-one, they understand the nuances, but when they speak in the public domain, it's really difficult to find a position in relation to that. So the measurements are very seductive, you could say. And PISA, I think, is one distorting factor there. School league tables is another one. I find it interesting that at some point the Minister of Education in Northern Ireland banned school league tables because he said, we are trying to rebuild a very divided society, and the last thing we need is that we begin to compare schools against each other. So he really understood some of the dangers of creating a competitive mindset in education. I see a number of results from these kind of developments. I think it has led to a narrowing of what counts in education. Very quickly, it always turns back to measurable achievement in a small number of curricular areas. And I'm not saying that reading and mathematics and science are not important, but that's not the totality of what matters in education. I also worry, and I've tried to say that before, that these developments promote a narrow conception of what counts as education, including the complex situated work of the teacher. Very quickly, we think of education in an input-output logic. A colleague in Germany says we've ended up with a cybernetic conception of education, the thermostat, where we set the desired end value and we keep pushing the system until we have that. And I think that misconstrues what happens in classrooms. As I said, I worry that this is not elevating the teacher, it's not supporting the complex professionality of teachers, but it diminishes it. So the teacher as a thinking and acting and judging professional is undermined by such a view of education. And the thing that also has been mentioned earlier today already, there is also something happening which in the literature is called performativity. And what is performativity? It is where indicators of quality become definitions of quality. You can have all kinds of questions about league tables, but you can say what league tables try to do is to indicate relative quality of schools or school systems or national education systems. That can be interesting information. It becomes performativity when countries begin to say what should be our main ambition, not to ensure good education for everyone, but for our country to end up in the top 5 of the global league table of educational performance. And I'm not making up this one, this is official policy in Australia at the moment. And there you can say something goes wrong, because what should be a helpful indicator of relative quality suddenly becomes an aim that is pursued for its own end. I also worked at a university where our vice-chancellor came to all the faculties and said, we have a new strategic ambition. We want to end up within 5 years in the top 10 of the Times Higher Education League Table. And then one of my colleagues asked the brilliant question, so Vice-Chancellor, what will we do once we have ended up in that position? You may want to guess the answer. He said, then we'll go for the top 5. And that shows the emptiness of these kind of ambitions, where you're no longer talking about what does it mean to be a good university here in this part of the country with all the complexities around us, but take the league table itself as your definition of quality. I've put a book there which I very much like by Diane Ravitch, who initially was quite enthusiastic about a particular push to the education system, but then began to see that this can quickly lead to cynical behavior, where school administrators can say, okay, if the only thing that matters is how we perform in the statistics, then we'll push on that and we'll forget everything else. So there you can see the dangers of that, and the book has some interesting analyses of how that can happen. So that's the dark part of the story, you can say. And on a beautiful afternoon in Porto, that's probably enough. So the question is, how can we, let's say, rebalance? What are some of the questions that need to be on the table, that need to be in the mix in order to have, I think, a better conversation about teaching and therefore a better focal point for teacher education? And I want to mention 3 points. I call them a 3-fold pushback, but if that sounds too aggressive, then maybe think of a different metaphor, a 3-fold rebalancing maybe. One thing that I think is really important is that we keep arguing for a broad understanding of what counts in education. That we do not stop by saying the basics are the most important. I had a meeting with European ministers and policymakers a couple of weeks ago, and the big question was, what do we do after COVID? and I suggested we need to go back to better basics. Not this quick reflex to say back to the basics, and we all know what the basics are. I'm not sure about that either. But what are the best basics? What, as countries nowadays, we really need to have at the heart of education? I personally would put a concern for democracy there. In my own work, I have suggested that we may have different views of what should matter in education, but at least we should all be aware that as educators, we always work, you can say, in 3 domains or with 3 agendas. I've called them domains of educational purpose. I think it's absolutely true that part of our work as educators is to make knowledge and skills, but even more so understanding and thoughtful action available to our students. That's the important work of qualification, because there we equip our students for action in professions, in work, but also to equip them to live together in complex modern societies. That's one part of our job, but another important part of our work as educators is to provide our students with an orientation. You can say we have to open the doors towards the world and help them to understand what this sometimes beautiful and sometimes crazy world is about. What matters, where it comes from historically, how you can find a sense of orientation. That, I think, is the important work of socialization. And that, I would say, is a different area that we need to work towards. And then I would say, ultimately, as educators, we want to get rid of our students. And I mean that in the most positive way. We want our students to lead their own lives, their own professional lives, their own personal lives, their own public lives, and to lead them well. We want them to end up as subject of their own lives and not as objects of all kind of influences from the outside. We can put all kind of words there. The educational literature has notions like autonomy there. I like this strange word of subjectification, because to be a subject not just means that you are in total control of your life. It also means, in a sense, that you let yourself be subjected to a world outside of you that is not just of your own making. So 3 domains of purpose is one way to say we really need to understand that our work as educators has this broad orientation and cannot be reduced just to knowledge and skills. One thing that irritates me is that the English language is quite poor where it concerns education, because in a sense we only have this word education, whereas in other languages, Dutch is quite close to German, there is a far more refined vocabulary, where there are actually different words that get you much more quickly to an understanding that education is this 3-dimensional work. Ausbildung, Bildung, Erziehung. If you put that into Google Translate, you end up with education, education, education. Probably that's what Tony Blair did in the past. So this is not just about what are the big purposes for education. It also goes back to the heart of the work of teachers, to acknowledge that as teachers, we are 3-dimensional professionals. We have work to do in each of these domains. And part of the struggle is to find a meaningful balance between the 3, because they often pull us in slightly different directions. And there are educational practices that are completely out of balance because they only push on the qualification. And when you think of what happens with young people in South Korea, for example, a big push on exam score, a culture where failure is not an option, it literally destroys young human beings. To find a balance is part of the work that educators need to do. And that is never fixed or pre-programmed, but that is each time a judgment. For me, this is also one of the weaknesses of a lot of research about what works, because the what works for what is often only understood in a one-dimensional way. An awful lot of that research only looks at academic achievement and forgets the other two. But then we do not really have interesting information for our educational practice, because it's not just what may work in one domain. We also need to understand what that may do positively or negatively in the other domains. So I think this raises a really important question for a much better kind of research. I've had this conversation with John Hattie. He has a passage somewhere where he says, yes, Gert Biesta says that there are 3 domains that are really important. Very funnily, he says, Biesta, she writes, so he didn't get his evidence right there. But then he says, but we all know that actually the knowledge and skills are the most important part. And I find that so disappointing that too quickly we accept that that should be the only thing that matters. So this is one suggestion to rebalance, that we need to keep arguing for a broad understanding of what counts in education. I also think we need to get rid of this language of that teaching is an intervention, because intervention, you can intervene upon an object, but when I am in a classroom, I meet other human beings in educational relationships, which are special relationships, but we shouldn't be forgetting that. Now for me, that's my worry with what I call a lot of quasi-causal conceptions of teaching that say if we do A, what's the likelihood that B will follow? Because very quickly they assume that in some way education works in a causal way. Now causality is an interesting idea, and when you look in physics, there isn't causality everywhere. Causality only happens under very specific conditions. It happens in closed systems that work in mechanistic ways and that work in a one-directional way. So the clockwork, you can say, is still the best example of what a causal system is. And then you can say, how about education? Well, education is an open system. We allow most of our students to go home at the end of the day. And you probably know what the problem is when you end up in a boarding school. It's not really good, I think, for your soul. Education is a process of communication, interpretation, sense-making. It's a semiotic system. And in the literature where this comes from, you can say education is a recursive system. Planets can only move as a result of all the forces around them, and the planet cannot wake up one morning and say, today I'm going to move in a different direction. But we as human beings have agency. We learn, we understand, and based on that, we act in different ways. Some people then say, well, this means utter chaos for education. If it's open, if it's all a matter of interpretation, if people have agency, how is it possible that anything happens at all in schools? And here I would say, this is part of the brilliant work we do as teachers. We are very good at reducing openness so that it becomes possible for our students to pay sustained attention. We are very good at focusing interpretation. That's why we have curricula, where we say, today we're going to look at this and not that. It's also why we have assessment, where we say, so what do you make of this? And then we look at where does that make sense and where is it nonsense? So we also reduce interpretation. And ultimately we want to help our students, for example, in teacher education, to think as teachers and not to think just in any crazy way, you could say. So our work as teachers is very much to make these open, interpretive, agentic systems to give them more focus so that something can happen. All this is good work up to the point where we reduce the openness too much, where we say to our students, we want 24 hours, 7 days a week, total control over you. Where we have a curriculum where we say there is no interpretation, take it or leave it. And where we say to our students, please stop thinking and just do what I tell you to do. Then suddenly an education system has become a system of indoctrination. So to be aware of where that flipping or tipping point happens is again another really important part of the work of teachers. Third point to rebalance, and I'm heading towards the end of what I have prepared, is that we should never forget that, as I said, we are always after the independence of our students. We want to equip and encourage our students to lead their own life and to do that well. So this third domain of the student as subject is really what is I think the heart of all education. And in the educational literature, there are beautiful phrases for that. As teachers, we try to arouse the desire in our students to want to exist as subject. Because there are students who think, oh, that's far too difficult, or that's not for me. And to keep gently pushing and saying, no, that is for you. Your freedom matters. Your democratic future matters. Step into the world, but don't think that you are in the center of the world. Philippe Mérieux. You can say encouraging our students to meet their freedom and to take it up as their freedom with a responsibility for it. Dietrich Benner, German scholar, Aufforderung zur Selbsttätigkeit, summoning to self-action. Not to say to your students, be yourself, but to say, be a self. Don't forget yourself. That, by the way, is the message I read in Rousseau's Émile. It's all about what do we do with our freedom. That means that at the heart of education we find existential questions, the questions of how to exist, how to live well. And those questions can never be solved with more psychology, sociology, not by digging into the brain, not by understanding our genetic makeup. As human beings, we have freedom, and the question is, how can we use that freedom well when we step into the world? So, 3 questions where I try to rebalance and get a better sense of the priorities in understanding teaching, in doing research, and in developing teacher education. That brings me close to a final observation, and then I want to say a few things about art and artistry. The observation has something to do with the eye of the teacher. And there is a tendency in education, I've shown that, to say teachers need to develop an empirical eye. They need to think of their work as a kind of experimental work where you do something and that has consequences, and then you need to observe very carefully what happens with your students, and then you act again. But that's not the only eye that we need to have as teachers. As teachers, we also need to have this remarkable capacity to see more than what is evident. I'm thinking about Daniel's story this morning. This teacher that could see that you were a horrible kid, but still the teacher who said, I believe in you because there must be a different future for you. And therefore, I'm going to stay with you, even if you keep running away and keep kicking and shouting. That is a teacher who not just had an empirical eye and saw this horrible child, is that fair to say, difficult young person in front of her, but was able to see more than just what's evident there. I think this is really important, to see possibilities that are not actual. That's part of the business we are in, opening futures for our students. Trust has an important role to play there. If we never trust our students, then they will always be caught in our authority. That also means that as teachers we should be able to see less than what is evident. A lot of students come to our schools with big piles of dossiers and all kind of assessments and tests that profile them and all their difficulties. And sometimes that's very helpful, but there is always the danger that we mistake the dossier for the student. So sometimes we need to say all that on the side, because if I only can see you through all that, again, it begins to block a different future for you. So the empirical eye is important, but I think teachers need very different eyes as well. And that, again, for me, goes to the heart of teacher professionalism. And if we just say it's all empirical, we miss something. It's a nice Norwegian book that talks about the focus of the teacher's eye on the unforeseen. And that, of course, goes in conversation with ideas about visible learning. There are things that are not visible, and we should be able to see those too. That then brings me finally to the account of teaching. How should we understand teaching? And there you will have seen that I have worries when we talk about interventions that are supposed to produce effects, and that with more research or more effort or more money, at some point will become perfect. That if the teacher does A, B will follow. Here I go back to Aristotle. And what I like about Aristotle and what I don't like about Plato is Aristotle is a philosopher of change. He understands that human life is messy, that we try out things with hope and good intentions, but can never be entirely sure what will happen. And of course we can try to rein that in, but there is always a danger that that goes too far. That's where I think teaching should be located, in the bios practicos, the practical life, the domain of the variable, not the eternal, as Aristotle calls it. And the work we do in those domains is what Aristotle characterizes as art, and sometimes art is a really nice word. You can also put craft there. It's all the work we do where we can never be in total control of what's happening because we are engaging with variable material, including other human beings. So this is not the world of causes and effects, but it's the world of actions, intentional action. Teaching is intentional action that has possible consequences. What I find valuable about Aristotle as well is that he says our work in the domain of the variable, the artwork, there are two different arts. There is the art of production, of making things, and there is the art of doing. And I think teaching has both dimensions. As teachers, we have an enormous amount of knowledge, how to do things, how to develop a curriculum, how to teach, how to create an atmosphere in a classroom, how to call a student to attention, how to assess, and so on. That, you can say, is the educational craft. But we do all that work because we are after something. We are after a future for our students to live their own lives. So there is never just a question, how do I do something here with my students? There is always also the question, what is it that needs to be done here? What should be done here? That's a normative question, that's not black and white, and for that we need educational wisdom. And these two together are deep understanding of craft, the craft of teaching, plus our constant attention for the question, but what is it that needs to be done here, so that we never simply just apply the know-how, but keep asking, why are we doing this? What is the orientation? That I want to suggest is the double art of teaching. And that is the understanding of teaching that I would like to reclaim in today's conversation about teaching and teacher education. Not to be dominant on the agenda, but as one of the things on the agenda there. Why artistry? For me, this is an account of teaching that makes much more sense to what I think I do every day as a teacher than the story of interventions and outcomes. I think that it gives a language to the profession to speak with much more nuance about all the complexities and nuances and the beautiful and difficult work we do each day. So it gives a language that's close to practice. And I think it is a language and a way of thinking that puts different questions for policy and research and teacher education on the table. And I'm not against research. Some people think I'm against research, but I want better research. I want research that fits the unique character of teaching. I also want better policy that understands the complexities and the deeply normative heart of education. And for me to think in terms of artistry and teaching as a double art helps in asking better questions and developing better policy. But it is more difficult, of course, than just to say it's all black and white. All this, I think, should begin with an interesting observation from an English scholar, Lawrence Stenhouse, who says, improving education is not about improving teaching as a delivery system. And he wrote this long ago. Actually, the original quote is even older. But I think we are very much in an age where we think teaching is a delivery system, and if we get it right at system level, then all problems are solved. Because education is always only made by teachers in concrete situations. And therefore, he says, the improvement of education has to start with the desire of the teacherly artist to improve his or her art. I like this one. I like stuff that fits on a t-shirt, but for this you need an extra large, I feel. Why reclaiming? Because the discussion is not new and the idea is not new. When you look at the literature, there are important contributions from scholars who have made this point. And that's why it is important that we keep not forgetting our history, keep reading back. That's hard work to do because history keeps growing. But we need to understand that in education we very quickly drift to very one-sided views. And often when we look back in history we can find a rebalancing. And here are some of the authors who I found very helpful. It's not just intellectual work, it's also practical and political work. So I'm working with colleagues in a number of settings to see, can we give this idea of artistry a place in our thinking about teaching and teacher education. I do that in Scotland with colleagues. Right now I have even more fun with colleagues in the Netherlands because there we work across a university, a teacher education college and an art college. And one, what shall I say, brilliant or crazy idea is, can we develop an art college for teachers? What would it mean if we place the education of teachers in the framing of the education of artists rather than, you can say, technicians? We are taking little steps and we'll see where that goes. So that's what I wanted to share with you. I think we live in an age of measurement and measurement has its place, but there is the danger that with the measurement comes a redefinition of teaching that I think is unhelpful to understand what teaching is about. We should be careful not to get too excited when people say, oh, the research has found that teaching matters and that teacher matters, because we always need to ask, how do they matter and what for? And I'm worried that often it ends up with a misunderstanding of the complexities of teaching. And I think if that is the only story we have to go into teacher education, then it will, I fear, undermine rather than enhance the beautiful work of teachers. And therefore, I think other questions that balance, I think this should be on the agenda when we talk about this future for teacher education. So regaining and reclaiming what I would see as the educational significance of teaching, that's really important so that we keep understanding why teaching matters, how it matters, and why it's such an interesting and challenging job. And that for me then goes straight back into teacher education, because if we don't have a conception of teaching, then we are at a loss if we want to do anything in teacher education. Is that difficult? Actually not. I think that at the heart of all the work of teachers is one simple question. And that's the question, what is educationally desirable here and now for this student, for this group of young people, for these children in this situation? Teachers who carry that question with them from day one in their teacher education and day one in their educational career, I think have a very powerful point of orientation that then over time they can keep widening and deepening. I like Bruner's idea of a spiral curriculum, where you say curriculum is never incremental, where you add little bits. No, you have to start with the most central question of the profession and keep working on it so that that question, you can say, remains a lifelong fascination. That's how I would develop teacher education, not just in Portugal, but anywhere where they would let me in. But I'm not sure who will. Thanks very much. If you want to read about this stuff, it's here.
Okay, so I'm having permission to have 3-4 questions. So it's up to you now. Shall we sit down? I said it was going to be challenging, interesting, and deep. And I told Gert never fails me, so I was confident that it was going to be like this. And obviously it's also very hopeful. And hope, as we know, is a very important political emotion. I don't know if we do have questions yet. They seem to appear, oh, yes. So I will skip my reading and trust that we can all read. So, Gert.
Well, there, is this word? Yeah, there's a topic. We can assume you all can decode, but can you all read? I think there's a deeper question there. And what do you do once you have read something? How can policymakers help teachers find a balance between the 3 domains of educational purpose? I would say, first of all, by taking these 3 domains, this broad understanding of what should matter in education, take them seriously at policy level. And that's, of course, more complicated than to say, no, there is only one domain that matters. So it is a more difficult message, but there I think policy can do a lot. One of the pictures, which I didn't explain, is a policy report. The Education Council in the Netherlands, the official advisory body for the government, wrote about the quality of education, where they also strongly argued we need a broader view of this, because so much of what comes to us always tries to narrow it. And policymakers, you can say they should be courageous, and I think that's part of what it is, because particularly in some countries there is media that always want to simplify and always has this reflex of saying, but the basics first, with very odd views about the basics. So you need courage, but also with that courage, you stand for the profession of teachers. So you do not stand there on your own, but you say this is the educational endeavor and we need to stand there together if we want to give the new generation a fair chance of a good life for all of them. Second one, can we reclaim the artistry of teaching without reclaiming education as more than outcomes and numbers? I think that's what the argument I try to develop is to say, to reclaim the artistry of teaching immediately means that you have to go beyond narrow views of what counts in education and narrow views of what counts as education. So it is a pushback against those reductions. How far you push back, where, that's always a judgment. My slippery slope said be very careful that, of course, the question of the quality of education is an important one, but before you know it, we've turned it into a technical question, and we have forgotten where we started. Can your views be reflected in public policy, i.e. laws? If so, how? My answer is yes, because I'm hopeful, but also I think that policy and laws are really important. We live in a time of crisis where we see how quickly public institutions, democratic institutions can fall apart, can be undermined. If we not all keep supporting them, keeping ourselves awake, but also if the legal structures there are not providing a safety net. The UK is not a very nice country to be in right now, because I think democracy is under pressure, also in relation to lawmakers. But I think a lot of this can have a place in policy. The question where you do that is an interesting one. I'm currently on an advisory committee in the Netherlands on the future of the curriculum for schools in the Netherlands. And there is a legal framework there which is quite open, so there's a lot of freedom for schools. But that legal framework sort of gives a sense not just of what all students should be doing, but also of what all students are entitled to. And I think that's already important that you have that there. Not to say, here are the learning outcomes and this is what all children need to learn, but also to say, in a civilized country, all children have the right to the arts, the right to movement and sports and physical education, maybe even the right to history or citizenship education. So there are legal frameworks that actually can secure this broader view of education, but that works differently in different countries. So in each country you need to think, where can this have a place? And if it's difficult to give it a place in laws, then it's even more a concern of, you can say, civil society and teachers as a professional group, not just individuals, to keep making the case for the importance of this broad view on education.
Okay. Thank you.
Me censuraram, não deixaram pôr a pergunta do sistema.